Today we will be discussing space sharing. So best practices for safeguarding your property and your mission. So I am going to spend some time today going over some of the benefits, some of the challenges, some of the considerations that you want to think about before you even get to kind of the next step of negotiating any kind of contract. A lot of this is going to be kind of what you need to think about up front, and then we'll go into how, we can help protect your organization through contracts, through negotiations, and through agreements. So space sharing can be beneficial to all parties. It can provide physical space for additional good within your community. It can provide income stream to the owner of the property, and it can expand your mission and your ministry. However, with that, again, there are a lot of challenges and considerations as well. So first and foremost, let's start with all the good things. And I will say, a lot of organizations today are looking for ways to maximize the properties that they have. A lot of organizations are not utilizing their buildings the same ways as they used to, and unfortunately are struggling with, bringing in money from their members to be able to further their mission. So one way is to allow others to utilize your space. That will allow you to bring in revenue, rent coming in. It may also allow you to share in some of the expenses that you have for your organization. For example, if you have another user in there, maybe you can split some of the janitorial expenses. If you have a list of capital repairs that need to be done, you can use some of the revenue to, make those repairs that you may have been thinking about for a long time, but did not have the funds to do that previously. And of course, most importantly, provide additional funding for your own mission and ministry of your organization. One key to this is finding the right tenant, and we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. But you want to make sure that you understand your own space and you understand who you're bringing in. This could create positive exposure to your organization. So, for a lot of religious organizations, we have these big, beautiful buildings, but people don't always know all the services that the organization can provide to the community and, what events they're hosting and what they can provide to members. And by allowing others to utilize their space, you're kind of broadening your reach. You're opening your doors to others and also allowing them to explore what you can provide and hopefully either, give more to the community and potentially get additional members and promote a positive image of your organization. By allowing others in the door, they see the events that are happening. They see what you can provide and hopefully want to become a part of that. There's also a potential for joint events. And, we're going to get into this a little bit later when we talk about finding the right tenant. But there are possibilities, if you are renting out some space to a school, there might be an opportunity for, joint events with that school. So the school understands who you are and what you can provide to them and to the community and vice versa as well. So now let's talk about some of the considerations as well. So before you get into, we're thinking about renting our space, we need to get an attorney who's going to help us draft this agreement. There are a lot of things that you need to do yourself internally before you even get to that step. So first and foremost, you want to understand your own building. You want to understand the needs of your own organization because you don't want to lease out space that you actually need and that is part of your own ministry and part of your own programming. So first and foremost, it's important to kind of take a step back and take inventory of your building. Understand when your building is going to be used, what days of the week, what times, how much of your building. if you're utilizing different parts of your building, is there a possibility that it could be shifted to one portion? Do you have multiple buildings? These are all things you want to think about internally to understand your own programmatic needs and the needs of your members. I will say for a lot of religious organizations, you are in a unique situation where a lot of times you are utilizing your space at nights and also on the weekends. So that 9 to 5, when other organizations could utilize your space, such as a school, daycares, other social services, they often want that 9 to 5 slot time. So a lot of times you are in a unique situation where you can continue to exist the same way that you were before, but could also bring in other users to your space without it, directly impacting any of the mission or programming that you already have. And then from the outset, also understand who's leading the charge here from your own organization and what approvals do you need to be able to get this through. Because the last thing you want to do is negotiate an entire agreement and you get to the end, and I have seen this time and time again, and the right people or not enough people were involved from the beginning, and it doesn't go through. And it ends up being a waste of time and money of the organization. So make sure maybe you have a committee, like a building committee, who speaks to the board of directors. Get an understanding of who should be involved in these types of conversations and ultimately who needs to approve this. In addition, you want to understand not only the program needs, but what your building provides. So for a lot of you are houses of worship, and you're going to be what we call community facility. So there's specific uses from like a department of buildings that you can utilize your building for. So if you're a community facility, you're not going to be able to necessarily rent out your space to a homeless shelter that has people sleeping over, or for other kind of like residential uses, or even some retail uses. So you also want to get an understanding of the classification of your building. What can you use it for? So again, understanding the program needs, but also just generally what your building is classified as. And then in addition to that is, for example, this room has an occupancy, a number of people that can be in this space. If you're renting out, your sanctuary, you need to know how many people can be in there. You want to make sure that your tenant is not putting your building in a situation where you're going to get violations, or, something worse can happen if there's a fire or whatever it is. Your goal is to safeguard that property. That property is your asset, and it is your job to make sure that you have thought about these considerations and have reached out to experts if needed to fully understand what you can do in your building. The next, and we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail, but I do want to stress this, is insurance. So I have seen a lot of clients that don't necessarily reach out to their insurance broker at the beginning. So when they're thinking about leasing or sharing space, it's important to call your insurance broker and let them know that this is what you're thinking about. Ask them if your current policies are sufficient to have other users in the building, because if something happens and you do not notify them that you have other users in the building, they can exclude them from your policy. And so it's important to get ahead of that, explain the situation, and ask them if what you have is correct, and also take it a step further. Ask them, what does this user also need from an insurance perspective? So what am I going to require of them as well? So it's both kind of your own insurance and then the insurance of whatever user is utilizing the space. So some of the challenges, and I'm sure a lot of you have kind of been in this situation before or, have experienced it in some sense, even if it's not with your own organization and it's just one of those awful roommates that we've all had at some point in our lives. But you want to find the right tenant. And it's very important, especially as a religious organization, where your mission and ministry is at your forefront. And you want to make sure that any user of your space is not going to conflict with the mission and the morals and the values that your organization upholds. The last thing you want is to be sharing space with another user that you're automatically clashing on. I will also say, just from like a programmatic kind of perspective and the day-to-day, it's not only that the organization has, similar values as you, but take the time to understand who the point person is at this entity. Because your organizations, no matter how well your agreement is written, if you are sharing space, things are going to come up. And you want to know that if you're sharing space with another organization, you can easily have those conversations with them, with two reasonable parties can kind of figure out what needs to happen on a day-to-day basis. If you need space here and they need here, you want to make sure you know who their contact people are and that you can actually communicate with them. I know it sounds simple, but you would be surprised, especially when it's, might be another religious organization, another nonprofit. You want to know who that person is. And then little things you want to think about as well. And a lot of these go into whether it makes sense for you to share space at this time. So security. I have some clients that share their space with 5 other nonprofit users. And, people are constantly coming in and out and in and out, and it becomes challenging. So you want to think about, do you have the building management and security to kind of take care of all of the people in your building? Because you are going to have responsibilities as the owner of the property. So if you need another security guard, who's paying for that? Is that coming out of the rent? Is that included? What are your own needs versus the needs of another organization? Again, these are things you just want to think about. Storage needs. So this seems very simple, but a lot of religious buildings are older and they don't have storage in all of the places that you're leasing. Are you letting your users keep their items in a closet? Are they taking their stuff back every time they're there? Are they there once a week? Are they there, multiple days? If you have a daycare that's there, they're not going to want to take their stuff out, but then maybe you have Bible study in there. How are you kind of separating whose is who and what can people use of the churches versus vice versa? So if they're using your sanctuary, can they use the organ? Can they use the microphones? This all kind of needs to be thought out in the beginning. And it goes a little deeper. It's not only can they use it, it's also taking a step back and understanding that there is some cost to your organization for this, right? Like there's going to be wear and tear of your building when you have others in your space. So you want to think about that. It's not just an immediate cost of this and that. It's also something breaks and they're using your microphone. It's something else that you kind of have to figure out and think about. And a lot of this kind of goes into the last point of loss of control of your building. This is a big mindset shift for your members and for the staff as well. It's not just your building anymore. You're sharing it. And you have certain requirements to fix things and provide things that you did not have before. And your members can't just kind of spring on you that they need this room at 7 p.m. at night because it's not going to be available at that time. So it's important to communicate that up front and make sure everyone really understands kind of what you're giving away, but also what you're getting in return and how that can impact and help the organization as a whole. And then the last thing is also just figuring out scheduling conflicts with your own organization. Make sure you have a calendar, understanding their needs. And if you're required to make certain repairs, you can't just tell a user, we'll do that in a week or two, our super's out, or we don't have the money to fix that right now. That's not gonna fly. So you need to think about maybe keeping some reserve funds for that, for any repairs that need to happen in your building, because you're gonna need to make those and you're going to need to have someone available. And all of those things cost money. So if you're having people in your space, you need to factor all of these in when you're thinking about what you're charging them. Because if you're not charging them the amount that you're spending, why are we doing this? You're just losing money in the end, and there will just be more wear and tear for your building. And it could be it's part of your mission to share the space, and that's kind of a different story. But if you're doing this to generate income, you really need to think about all this before and factor it into kind of who's responsible for what and what those expenses are going to be. So now the fun part. So I'm going to go through just some of the kind of material terms that we would help negotiate in a contract. And your contract is going to differ based on the type of user that you have and the length of time and whether it's a shared use or, just leasing out an entire building. But for the most part, the material terms that I'm going to go over are going to be general to all of these agreements. So just very quickly, a facility use agreement is more of like a one-off event. So maybe you allow users to utilize the building for a wedding. And those agreements are pretty simple. A lot of religious organizations allow for these types of events and unfortunately do not have any agreement in place, which really opens you up to some liability. So you don't necessarily need to have a full lease, but you do need to have what we're going to go over, these material terms in a written document that you can give out to anyone that's going to be utilizing your space, even if it's for one night. A use and occupancy is more so if you're sharing the space. So maybe like you have an AA group that comes in every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 2 hours. They should be entering into something more substantial than a facility use agreement. Again, it's not going to be a full lease. They're not going to be repairing your building and making real modifications. And then the third is an actual lease agreement. So for some of our clients, they have more than one property. They might have their church and they might have a school building, and they're leasing out the entire school building. That's going to confer a lot more rights and obligations on a user, right? If they're utilizing the entire space, you're going to want to make sure that they're repairing it, and a lot of that work is off of the owner of the property. So some of the material terms, and again, they'll differ, but all of these terms will be in any of these agreements that you will see. So first, it sounds simple. You want to properly identify the parties. I cannot tell you how many times I've had another nonprofit or another organization tell me the name of their organization, and then I check it with their certificate of incorporation, and it's totally different, and they just did not recognize it. So you want to make sure you get all of their corporate documents so you actually even know who your tenant is. you want to clearly define the space. So this becomes very important when we talk about shared use, because it's kind of like a juggling, and you want to make sure that you've identified the space you need and the space they need. So here's just an example. I find attaching floor plans are always helpful, and kind of just highlighting what space is theirs and what space is yours. And then in the agreement, you're gonna actually write out, like, they utilized the highlighted space Monday and Tuesday from 2 to 4. And you're going to include whether they're responsible for cleaning up, if they're responsible for preparing it, what bathrooms they can use. Like, if you are sharing space, you need to get into like the nitty gritty of details so that you don't find yourself in like a clash. And this becomes even more true if you have multiple users in your space. And then you also want to be very clear about how they can use the space. So if they are using it as a food pantry, then they are using it as a food pantry. And that's the only permitted use for that. It is not like you have the space, utilize it for, what you need, because that's going to impact the classification of your building again. Like, you have specific requirements of how you can use your space, and so does your user. And it also goes into, you want to make sure, again, that their use doesn't conflict with your own mission. And so you want to be very specific about how they can utilize it. Of course, what the term is, and this we'll get into in a little bit, because the term really matters, because there are certain approvals that you will need if your term is longer than 5 years. You want to include the rent and escalations. I have a lot of clients will say, after we'll have a lease for 2 years and then we'll allow them to renew it. But they never discussed what the new rent would be after in the renewal. And you don't want to leave this open. So if you have the rent for what it is now, and if you have a renewal, that's what the rent is at that time. Repairs and maintenance. Again, it's going to differ depending on how much space they're utilizing, but you have to know your own organization and what your capacity is to make certain repairs. And also, the downside, if you're not making the repairs and you're allowing a tenant to do that, then they're making repairs to a building that you own. So that is something you also want to think about. You have to weigh both of them. And there are ways to kind of meet in the middle. Certain repairs maybe the landlord will make, but at the tenant's expense. You have to kind of decide if you want to be in control of all that. And a lot of it will depend on the agreement. If you're entering into a facility use for a wedding, they're not making repairs to your building. They break something, they're going to pay you for it, and you're going to make the repairs yourself. If they're leasing an entire building, they're probably going to have to make the repairs themselves with your approval. Utilities and operating expenses. I would say this is like one of the number one things I really try to get organizations to think about when you're thinking just about the considerations. So how much are you paying for your own utilities, right? Because if you're bringing someone in and you say, oh no, we pay the utilities, that's a big expense if you have multiple other users in your space. And there are different ways that you can negotiate this. So for some clients, they say, they'll take inventory. The last year, we spent X number on utilities for the last 12 months. And you could say, for the year going forward, we're going to continue paying that X amount because that's what we're utilizing, but our user is responsible for anything above that. So if we're paying $300 a month and the bill comes out to $600, they're going to pay $3 and you're going to pay $3. Or you could do it based on square footage as well. There's multiple ways that you can plan for this, but you have to think about it you have to know what you're paying for the last year or two, or there's going to be no way for you to realistically understand what that expense is. And then, as we mentioned before, insurance. So there's always going to be risks associated with allowing others to utilize your space. And before you enter an agreement, you're essentially deciding that you think that, the benefits are going to outweigh the risks. But you still need to work with an attorney to make sure that that really can come true in your agreement. So there's two ways that help protect you as an organization and help protect your building. And that's through insurance and indemnity language. So I get this question often that says, well, if we're forcing our tenant, our user, to have insurance, why do we have to have insurance? So you, as the owner of the property, are always going to maintain your own insurance. The tenant, in addition, is going to have their own insurance as well that will cover their usage, their area of the building, and their items within the building. And this is why I said early on, when you're thinking about these considerations, reach out to your insurance broker, because they will give you not only what you need, but what you should require of your tenant as well. Because the last thing you want is there's a situation and now you have two insurance companies fighting with each other, but you realize that your user doesn't have the proper insurance. And your insurance is not going to cover that, because they're not going to cover incidents that happened necessarily with your tenant. You want to also make sure that you get an actual certificate of insurance and check it with the requirements of your agreement. There are countless times, and I think people aren't necessarily looking at the documents. And so you'll get a certificate of insurance, and it is not anywhere near the level of what is required in your agreement. So you want to make sure that you not only ask them for their certificate, you check it with your agreement and make sure it lists your organization as an additional insured. And I will say it gets a little complicated, but if your property is maybe owned by your denomination, you want to make sure that it includes the property owner, but also your congregation itself. So it has both parties on that insurance certificate. Indemnification. So indemnification is basically language in the agreement that says that if something happens, there's a claim on your property. Let's say you're renting it out to a soccer club and a kid trips and falls and breaks his leg, and now he is bringing a claim. He's not going to just bring a claim against the tenant. He's going to bring a claim against you as the owner of the building. So if you have strong indemnity language, it's going to say that if a claim is brought in, your tenant has to have counsel that you've approved of and basically hold you harmless. So you're not going to be responsible for that claim, because anyone that's giving a claim, anyone that is bringing a lawsuit is including anyone that is close by. So if you are in the vicinity of what happened, you will be named. And even if you had nothing to do with it, you still need to defend it. And so with strong indemnification language, you can make sure that those costs are covered. And this language, again, is going to be even in a facility use agreement. You have a wedding and somebody trips and falls, you want to make sure that that language is in there, because it really can expose your organization to a lot of liability. And then default and termination. If things don't go wrong, you want to make sure that you have the ability to terminate, to accelerate the rent, and that you also have what we call self-help. This is your building, and you need to make sure if something goes wrong, even if your tenant or your user is responsible for repairing stuff, if they're not, you need to be able to step in. You need to step in, make those repairs, and then charge them plus extra fees, whatever's in your agreement. Because at the end of the day, this is your building and you need to protect it. And if they're not going to follow the agreement, you need the ability to kind of step in and take control of the situation. All right, so this is real property tax could be like its own lecture. So I'm not going to bore you with all the nitty-gritty, but I will say this topic could not be more relevant right now because the city is really cracking down on religious organizations because they clearly have budget deficits, and it has become more difficult in the last year or two, especially with leasing space. So first and foremost, the rule generally is that a religious organization or a nonprofit organization that owns its property and is using it for its own tax-exempt purpose, and again, that's the key, its own tax-exempt purpose, will maintain their real property tax exemption. If they are leasing out their property, then they are no longer utilizing whatever portion they're leasing for their own tax-exempt purpose. But there's an exception to the rule that a nonprofit can lease to another nonprofit if the rent, and it gets a little complicated, but if the rent doesn't exceed your building maintenance and carrying expenses. So, for example, if you are leasing out your building for $100,000 a year, then the amount it costs to maintain and carry your property cannot exceed $100,000 a year. It does get very nuanced when you are sharing space. But what I have seen with many of my clients now is when you go to submit your renewal for your tax exemption, they're going to ask you if there are any other users in your space. And you're going to attach your agreement, and they will likely come back to you with a host of questions, and they're going to want you to spell out what your expenses are for your building and what you're bringing in. So it's something, again, you want to think about, and also make sure in your agreement that if this does happen and for whatever reason you can no longer get your exemption or you receive what we call a partial exemption. So if they're utilizing 10,000 if your user is utilizing 10,000 square feet of your space and your building is 5,000 square feet, you're going to you may get a partial exemption. Well, they'll only exempt the portion you're using, not the portion you're leasing out. Who's going to be responsible for those taxes? Because those taxes, if you're anywhere in, the boroughs, are going to be very expensive. And so you want to make sure that you properly put in your agreements that the tenant, if they trigger that they're going to be responsible for it. Or maybe you have a right to terminate. You just want to make sure that you've really thought through that section, especially now because it's becoming more and more prevalent. And just be ready that if Department of Finance does come, that you're able to substantiate your claims. And if anyone wants to talk about this later, I can kind of give you some tips on how to respond and how to deal with this. But it definitely does come up. I will say, if you are renting to a for-profit entity, there is no exception. So that is critical to understand. So again, you may receive a partial exemption. So if you're a church and you're leasing out 1,000 square feet of your building to a for-profit entity, that 1,000 square feet is going to be taxed. So you need to make sure that your tenant, your user knows that they're going to be responsible for paying it. Or it really goes back to what we discussed at the beginning. Like if you don't think about these considerations, you have to decide whether it's worth it for you to lease out your space. Because if you're going to lease out your space for $20,000 a year, but your taxes are $30,000, then you're paying someone else to use your space, essentially. And this happens a lot. So definitely something you want to consider upfront. And I've also seen situations where a user says that they're a nonprofit and they're not a nonprofit. So, and when you submit to Department of Finance, they ask you for proof. They're going to want to see their governing documents. So when you enter into an agreement, make sure you have those documents, because it's going to go back and help you with making sure their name is correct, but also validating that you really can get this tax exemption. Okay, so corporate approvals. This goes back to understanding internally what you need and externally as well. So make sure you review your bylaws. I think you all heard the Attorney General's office, and some of you went to the bylaws lecture, but understand your own documents and who needs to approve any kind of agreement that you are entering into from the outset. And then also understanding the New York State law. So for religious corporations, and the OAG's office mentioned this, if you are selling, mortgaging, or leasing for a term exceeding 5 years, so if you're leasing for over 5 years, and that includes renewals. So even if you have a 3-year with a 2-year renewal, that's still 5 years. You need to get approval of the transaction. So this is something that you want to consider, because it's going to cost more money to do this, obviously, to petition to the Attorney General, have an attorney put that together for you, and it's going to take time. So that process can take 6 months. So if you're looking to lease out your space for over 5 years, but you need approval, you can't just lease out your space in a month. You know, that time period, that commencement is going to be after you are able to get approval. And then, again, this could be its own lecture, but essentially what you are petitioning for is to show that your lease is fair and reasonable and promotes the interest of your corporation. So you're going to have to get an appraisal, and you're going to have to show that the rent you're receiving exceeds what that appraised value is. And again, it gets tricky when you're also thinking about keeping costs down for your tax exemption. So a lot of these, unfortunately, don't really work together, because the Attorney General's office wants to see you bring in as much money for your organization. Department of Finance wants to make sure you're not bringing in more than the cost of your building. So you kind of have to weigh these two. And then that the purpose of the organization is promoted. So, you know, how are you going to be using the funds that you're getting in from the rent? Are you using it to further the mission of the organization? Is this going to benefit your members? And again, a lot of that goes into understanding what this lease is so that you can explain how it benefits. You know, you've taken into consideration the taxes, you've taken in consideration the utilities and cost of repair and security needs and storage and all of these small things. So at the end of the day, you know that entering into this agreement promotes the interests of your organization and can truly benefit them. So now I am going to open it up for questions. Sure. Do you want to just come over? Sorry.
One, don't want to
Oh.
about this office. You have expert.
Sure. So your question was, you going to?
Was it the application or response for DOF? The response? Sure. So it's going to be very fact specific, but what I have been seeing lately is that you will submit whatever agreement, and I will say a lot of people say, oh, this isn't a lease, it's a use and occupancy. They're referring to everything here, just to be clear, in their request. So you're gonna submit a copy of that, and usually their response is very black and white. Can you show us the rent you're receiving? So if you're receiving $100,000, and can you show us the building carrying costs and maintenance of your property? So it gets very nuanced because there isn't a real definition on what is carrying costs, maintenance, and depreciation. But it can be pretty widely defined. So it could include like snow removal, trash removal, necessary repairs that you have, certain equipment that you have. It can include like legal expenses for the lease, if there's anything you needed to do for your lease, like to prepare this space. So if you have these types of questions, and kind of, I can give you more specifics after, but what I will say is you're not going to be able to Google what the definition is, unfortunately. And DOF has been notorious for making it very unclear. But what I have seen succeed is making an actual spreadsheet of everything that I believe in my experience has counted as building depreciation and expenses, and making sure that that number is higher than the rent that you're receiving. So I know it's a clear answer because there is no clear answer, but you do want to include some kind of like Excel spreadsheet explaining that. Sure.
Right, thank you, Jodi. Quick question about weddings and funerals that are not within the Sunday morning worship flow. And a non-member slipping and falling or tripping on the stairwell. How liable are we to that, and are we open for litigations?
So before you head back, just to make sure I understand your question, this is for events outside
of Sunday worship.
Sure.
Or are those falling under worship parameters?
Yeah, so it kind of depends, and it's a little bit of a gray area. If it's part of your organization events, it's going to be covered under, your own insurance policies that you have. If it's an outside event, that's really where you want to have what we call the facility use agreement, so that insurance kicks in, and they can get insurance just for the specific event, and also that indemnity language to make sure that when that claim does come through, that the church is not going to be the one that has to pay to litigate or defend itself.
So, Jodi, I have a rectory, a brownstone, historic 4-story, 4,000-foot building in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, that we need a tenant. The tenant has left after many, many years, and we need another tenant to fulfill that $84,000 a year we were receiving. Agents, or do you know anybody?
How do you find the tenant? So, first and foremost, if it is a rectory and you're renting it out just to another individual?
No, nonprofit.
To a nonprofit. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So first thing is you can speak to a broker. We're happy to kind of refer you to people that are in the nonprofit world that can help find, a good partner for you. Because like I said, a lot of it is like finding the right user. And then you want to make sure from your tax perspective that the rent that you're receiving, is not going to exceed the building maintenance and carrying costs of that property. So some of it's going to go into your own due diligence that you're going to need to do as we discussed all of those considerations. And once you've done that and you're ready to find another tenant, then I would reach out to a broker that can help facilitate finding the right user for you.
Well, hopefully you have some recommendations or a list.
Sure. We
I'll
give
contact
some-
you for your card afterwards.
Yes,
Thanks.
no problem.
Hello. Two questions.
Sure.
What all of what you spoke about was about finding someone who's renting the space. What if you have multiple renters? Do those requirements are they specific to each renter, or is it collectively how much in terms of rent has to be less
do you
than
mean
the
for the
spending?
taxes?
Right.
So they're going to look at it from the totality of your building.
The total, okay.
So they're going to say you're receiving $100,000, even if it's broken out in 20,000. You know what I mean?
Right,
By
right.
5 different users.
Right.
They're still going to want to see that rent is going to be less than your building expenses.
Collectively, their rent.
Collectively, but to be honest, you can make the again, it's a gray area with DOF, and you can kind of make the argument either way. I would kind of look at your situation and see which way it makes the most sense. It could be from, the totality of it, or there are certain, for example, some parts of people's buildings, it might be kind of separate. It might cost more. The place in the sanctuary might need more building repairs, or there might be some shared uses. So there's ways to kind of
Okay.
negotiate and kind of figure out the proper language to put in front of them to make it work.
And then you talked about 3 different agreements. You didn't mention license agreements. Is that something that is also?
Yeah, so a license
possibility.
agreement would be very similar to a use and occupancy agreement. It kind of just has a different name, but it would be a situation where you're allowing someone to either share the space or utilize it for not a one-off event, but kind of a longer term event. And then the other thing I also didn't discuss, because it's, a longer lecture, would be a full ground lease of your site, which really would have a lot of different parameters that we would need to get into.
Okay.
Sure.
Hi, Jodi.
Hi.
Hi. I'm going to go back to what you specifically mentioned about the insurance for both entities, whether for the church or the building owners versus as when you're sharing your space with others who are coming in for an event. For example, as you mentioned, the wedding, a wedding reception. And not to be more specific to a situation where we have had our space sharing agreement. We redrafted it. Actually, I worked on it for the church council. And in terms of the insurance, which they had purchased, they had their own, but the insurance, the way that is done for a one-day event, is for the day, and it ends at 12:01 a.m. What we found out consistently with these space sharing events, that the space sharer tends to stay in the building. Now we're talking about liabilities after 12:01 a.m. So speaking with our insurance, what they had recommended that we add an extra day of insurance that they must adhere to, pay for 2-day insurance instead of the 1 day. Even as it is done, and of course they're not agreeing to it, they went over the maximum that's allowed it into the space sharing space, which is specifically our parish hall. So of course, we're losing our mind, thinking of liabilities and so forth. Now, the fact that they had went ahead and paid for that 2nd day of insurance, does that entitle them at this one, even though it's 12:15, to still be able to stay in the building, 3 or 4 hours later? Or is that just at this point to cover us in the event of any incident that may happen? How does that work?
Yeah, so it will depend on the exact language of your agreement, but provided that your agreement says that they need to be out at 12:01, no matter whether they have the insurance or not, they're not allowed to stay past 1201. So the extra day of insurance would be to cover kind of what you're saying, a worst case scenario. But technically they would be, in default of that agreement if they stay later. And part of that is knowing your users, right? If you have a wedding, it's not going to be so easy to just, people aren't going to just leave at 12. You need to make sure that you as an organization have someone there that's saying your time is up. Everybody leave the building. I'm locking the building right now.
So for example, our event must end at 11 p.m. So would you say that's fair? I have a different connotation to that. When I sit in the council meeting, if I paid for a 2-day insurance, doesn't that somewhat bind me to drag my feet and stay as long as I want because I have another day of insurance?
But you're not paying for another day of rent, So if you're paying $500 to utilize the space
Until 11 p.m.
And they want to stay later, then they need to pay you for the next day of rent too.
Okay, that's clear. Just want to make sure that we're not, sued or held liable to say, hey, I paid for an extra day of insurance. Why are you kicking me out sooner than that time? Sure. Okay, clear, thank you.
Sure.
I didn't know him actually what to handle that.
Okay, yes.
We essentially handle that is to make sure you take fairly significant spirit deposit.
Okay,
And the adherence of every hour, all plus you as secure deposit.
okay,
And if we need tenants that you have to be clear the light, there is default. With every hour of default, right?
Yes.
So it's this X number of dollars, so it up the church that's, and if that was
I just have that in our agreement.
Turn the lights off, lock the building.
Okay, all right, that's it. Thank you.
all right.
Yep.
I just have one question. Hi, Jodi. Thank you.
Sure.
The question I have, you talked about nonprofit can rent to another nonprofit, provided that it doesn't exceed, I guess, the church property expenses, right? Is that correct? Could you talk a little bit more about what if it does exceed?
Are you talking about from a tax perspective, real property tax perspective?
Well, not only because our church, we have a early learn program that we've had for 40 years. And of course, we're not making any money out of it because it is a mission and the church thinks it's just that important.
Sure.
So they're
Yeah.
nonprofit, we're nonprofit. So talk a little bit more about that for me.
Yeah,
please.
I mean,
Thank you.
and I think it goes back to what I was saying. You want to think about the considerations, and if your consideration is that you want to generate revenue to help your mission, then you want to think about your lease very differently than if your mission is to provide other services from another nonprofit or entity to the community. So doesn't have to be that the funds that you're getting in, outweigh your expenses. But if your purpose is to generate income, then you want to think about all the considerations and the cost it is to have a tenant in the space before you enter into a lease.
Well, there was a time where they were, if people want to make the profit, but I guess through the mandates of the federal city coming together, in order to keep those early programs, the board, the city had to fund, the board members for that particular, for the early learn. So now we have to, so that everything is paid,
Yeah, and that's going to kind of be, that's kind of the decision that you'll have to make internally as to whether it makes sense to continue that and whether that is part of your mission or not.